I'd like to thank everyone who is joining us today. Welcome to today's CNCF webinar, How to Better Understand Kubernetes Workloads Using Octant. My name is Christian Jans. I'm a cloud strategist and co-founder at Arctic Foxes and also a CNCF ambassador. Technically, I'll be moderating today's webinar. And in this regard, I would like to welcome our today's presenter, Wayne Witzel III, who is an Octant maintainer at VMware. A few housekeeping items before we get started. During the webinar, you're not able to talk as an attendee. There is a Q&A button at the bottom of your screen, so quite technically down here. Please feel free to drop all your questions in there and we will get to as many as we can at the end. This is an official webinar of the CNCF and as such is subject to the CNCF Code of Conduct. Please do not add anything to the chat or questions that would be in violation of that Code of Conduct. Basically, please be respectful and nice to your fellow participants and also the presenters. Please also note that the recording and slides will be posted later today to the CNCF webinar page at cncf.io/webinars. And with that, I will hand it over to Wayne to kick off the presentation.
Oh, great. Thank you so much, Christian. Yeah, thanks. First, let me again say thank you to everyone for taking time out of your day to come and learn a little bit more about Octant. So with that, we'll get started with this webinar. So using Octant platform to better understand a workload within Kubernetes namespace. And the agenda today, I'll go briefly over about me and who I am. And then I'll do a kind of an overview of Octant just from a UI perspective to give folks an idea of what they're looking at for those who haven't seen it before. And then we're going to get to the main portion of the demo, which is to create and explore a workload. And we will use Octant to kind of debug some problems and step through various things that one might experience when they're trying to get a containerized workload up and running in Kubernetes. And then at the end of that, we'll have a Q&A. So me, I live in Durham, North Carolina, on a 18-acre farm. I have lots of animals, and I've worked in open source tools for some time. Was at Red Hat and Canonical and SourceForge, among other companies. And currently, I'm a maintainer, one of the maintainers of Octant, and I work at VMware. So I just want to say that, like, the thing that excites me about Octant, right, is kind of this statement right here, and this highly extensible platform for developers to better understand the complexity of Kubernetes. And I think we're building something that's pretty exciting and pretty awesome for developers to do just this. But this question is, or this statement is a little kind of broad, and so I want to just touch before we get into the demo, kind of exactly what that means.
Wayne, quick question. Do you want to share the slides as we can see the quote? That would be appreciated.
Yeah, sorry. Oh, I'm sharing. There we go. Hold on. Share. Present. There we go.
Awesome. That fixed it.
There we go.
Perfect. Thank you.
There we go. Okay, great. So yeah, so here's the quote I was talking about. This is directly from our README. This is the highly extensible platform for developers to better understand the complexity of Kubernetes clusters. And more specifically with Octant, to really get a high fidelity view of a namespace, and even further of your workload as a developer in that namespace. And so, though Octant has a lot of the things that you will see in like a typical dashboard, we're really going for creating views that help to give you that information that is hard to obtain, or that you have to kind of piece together a bunch of streams of information to obtain, specifically around like how things live in your cluster, how they're all connected together, and then further into what problems those things might be experiencing, and then actionable items that you can take to kind of fix those problems. So we do this by, Octant kind of ships with a client that has a set of views and actions that you can do within a cluster. It's kind of like our version of like the batteries that are included with Octant. And all of those views that we're shipping with Octant could in theory be kind of developed using our Octant's plugin system, which we'll get in, I'll touch on briefly in the demo. but that's where that extensible platform comes from, is the component-based design of Octant makes it very easy for someone to take some custom resource or take some third-party tool or some other API that they want to visualize within or as part of or alongside of their cluster and their workload. They can do that with plugins and Octant. And so that's kind of what that statement is referring to, is that the extensible platform is what we're providing with plugins. And then our goal is to create that view that really makes it easy to understand what's happening. So some of the things that I personally use Octant for is, like, almost every day is just a UI for kubectl. That's just like the baseline. Like, there's a lot of things in kubectl that I can just use Octant for. I use it to kind of better understand a workload that I'm not familiar with. So if I'm deploying some new thing with a CRD or something like that, I can use it to kind of like quickly at a glance see maybe how some of those things interact, or just kind of like what the object name and the list names are of those CRDs and those custom resources. So and then the final one of the other things, the final thing is I use it to kind of explore and debug workloads. And that's what this demo is really going to focus on, is the exploration and debugging of a workload as you're putting it into Kubernetes. The idea for this demo came from working with someone who didn't have a whole lot of Kubernetes experience, but they had a lot of config management and Ansible and other experience. And I wanted to just kind of watch them struggle with getting a workload running up in Kubernetes, and using Octant to kind of help guide that process along. So that's where it's kind of the motivation and the purpose of this demo came from. So with that, I am going to move right into the demo. Reshare here. All right. So so I've downloaded Octant and I've run it locally, and currently Octant will look for your kubeconfig in all of the usual places. It'll also respect the kubeconfig environment variable, and it runs locally as the permissions that kubeconfig has. And so I just want to go over this UI quickly, kind of moving from top to bottom, right to left, kind of touch on each item. I'm not going to drill down into each item right now. We'll do that during the demo, and then people can ask questions and things during that process. So while I'm demoing, I encourage folks to ask questions, and if I see them and I'm able to answer them kind of in line, I'll do that. But we have Brian, Sam, and Milan here, also able to field and help with the Q&A questions as they come up. So even if I'm not able to answer them live during the demo, they may be able to. And then at the end, we're having a dedicated kind of Q&A block of time as well to get to any questions that may have been missed or that we didn't have time for while going through this demo. So first, I just want to, so we'll start up here. This is the context switcher. Currently, I only have a single context, but if I had multiples, this would kind of let me switch through them. Next up, we have a namespace selector, which will let me switch through the different namespaces that I have access to. We have the label filter selection, which currently we have no filters. And then on the far left side is this nav menu. It's a collapsible nav menu. It comes collapsed by default. And that's actually how I'll be using it throughout the demo as collapsed. But for folks who want to see more of the context and see more of the labels, they can slide it out and see all that information. Each section of the navigation is kind of divided up into areas of responsibility. So this first section here is all about the current namespace. It includes just like the namespace overview, which is what you're seeing now, a breakdown of workload information and discovery and load balancing, config and storage, and custom resources. There's also some RBAC stuff and events. And we'll get into some of these throughout the demo. The cluster overview section is things that are specific to the cluster as a whole. And that's stuff like namespaces and your custom resources, the definitions, the CRDs and nodes, things like that. And then finally, there's a section down here that's dedicated to plugins. Plugins that get added to Octant can be treated as a module. So if you think of each of these icons you're seeing are a module, then plugins can also act in that fashion. So the current namespace is pretty boring. There's just some demo things here that I've set up. So what I want to do is I want to create a namespace that we're going to be using for this demo specifically. So I have a namespace YAML here that I'm going to apply. And that'll get us our CNCF Octant webinar namespace created. And then once that's there, we will move into creating the deployments and the configs and things like that, and we'll see those showing up. So I've applied the namespace, and now we can see that it's showing up here in the namespace list. It wasn't there before. So we'll select it, and as expected, there's not much here. So what we've done is we've taken this little JSON server Docker file, and we've created a local image for it because this is what we're developing. We want to deploy this thing. And we've gotten some help by searching online and Googling, and we've managed to create a service. You know, we need an ingress, and we've got our namespace, and we've created a deployment. You know, let me pull these up 1 sec. So I'll show you I just want to show you the deployment and the that we're going to be using. One there. I'll just go to the Octant talk. Oh, demo. It's Octant demo. So I'll show you the namespace that we're going to be using here. Created this set of YAML here. And that's so here we go. So this is our deployment. It is using our CNCF webinar namespace. It's using the 8080 port. It's got our image that we've created of JSON server and our local registry and all of that. And we're also going to be using this service, which I showed before. Same thing, 8080 mapping from 80 to 8080 on the outside, the selector, things like that. So there are some errors in here that are intentional, and they are errors that were made when doing this that were great to kind of fix and solve with Octant. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to just apply the YAML that I showed quickly there. And so I just did that, and you can see this is real time. This is the result of me applying that YAML into the cluster. So the YAML successfully applied with my kubectl command. Everything said created, and everything went perfect, right? So as someone new to Kubernetes, right, I would think, oh, well, if it applied, it must work. But it turns out that is not always the case. So using Octant, I can see that there are some issues with some of these things. We're getting, there's a status indicator on my pods and my deployment that are showing some type of error message. And so I'm going to use Octant to kind of try and determine what these problems are. And one of the easiest ways to do that with Octant is to use this resource viewer. So this kind of shows you already how things are kind of related in the cluster. Whereas when I created this, I didn't create a replica set. I didn't actually create a pod. I just created some deployment YAML. And now I can see that, okay, this deployment YAML is generating these things, and this is how they're kind of interconnected. And then Octant is also telling me quickly that there's some type of issue with these things, right? That even though this replica set is created, none exists for my deployments, and I'm expecting one, but I have zero. And so looking through this information, we know immediately that there's a problem. Whereas even with the kubectl commands, we would have to already be looking at events and logs and trying to determine what's going on, looking through a bunch of different commands on a bunch of different resources. And Octant is kind of grouping all those together to make it easy to find. So, and one of the things that we can see here is that Octant itself provides the ability to just see the list of all the events within the current namespace. And by doing that, we can see that there are some events that maybe we don't really understand what they mean. You know, there's some errors here, but there's some that are actually pretty clear, which is that this container image is not present. And if we look and we think, okay, well, I was the one who typed in that container image, so I kind of know what it should be, maybe, right? So we can go look and we can decide, okay, well, maybe we want to fix that. So the involved, so we can click on the event, we can see more details about it, and then we can go right to the involved object, right? And in doing so, we're at the level where that error happened, right? So with a couple clicks, we're now putting ourselves into the context of where this error message is originating from. And we know that this image is what is wrong, because the events told us that that's what is wrong. We're also seeing the current state right here. So I made a plugin, because I use Kind and Docker a lot, that I had installed when my friend was going through this, and the plugin will show me my local images, right? And one of the things that's nice is that you get the tag, but I also get the images that are in my Kind registry here. And so this is an example of just what you can do with a plugin. You know, it's not necessarily related to Kubernetes, but in my case, it's related to Kind and my local Docker images and what I want to do here. So by here, I can see that the tag that I'm supposed to be using is actually this latest tag. And if I go back, I can just use the back button in the browser here. If I go back, we'll see that it's currently set to current. So that's an easy correction to make. And this is exactly what happened was my friend went and they said, oh, well, I'll just change that here in the pod, right? Just, it's latest. And they hit update, and you know, it worked. It actually, it got applied, and they went to the resource viewer and everything was green. So like, oh, perfect. Now I'm set. Everything's green all the way down. That means it'll just work. So in fact, we can just go try and visit this thing. We can see what it does. It says there's no healthy upstream. So it's not quite working. So then we're like, okay, well, let's go back into the pod, which we know is what is the thing that is running our application, right? And from right within the pod, what we can do is we can just attempt to test it, because there's this ability to port forward directly to the pod, and our pod is exposing this set of container ports on 8080, and we can just click there and we can test that that's working. But it's not working. So, okay, so that makes us think, well, all right, so if I can't connect directly to my pod with this port forward, then something must be wrong with the pod itself. So the next step was to go into the logs and take a look. So we went into the logs and we saw that, well, look, this is running, right? I can see that it's running. I can see that the server has started up and it appears to be listening for requests. So what's going on here? And it actually took a second, because we're both staring at it, and we realized that what's going on is that this is here, it's listening on port 80, right? And if we go back and look, oh, well, we set it to 8080, right? So simple enough, right? We go back into the YAML, we find where this thing has this, right? And we just edit it here, right? We think that's but we can't edit it there, right? And we get this semi-cryptic message, but the important part is that you cannot change any other fields of a pod except for the allowed editable fields, right? And container port is not one of those things that you can change on a pod. Well, how do we change it? This is where the resource viewer comes back into play, right? Even though we don't have a really deep understanding of why this pod even was created in the first place, we just know that it happened to get created. We can deduce that the deployment that we defined is what's actually controlling this pod, right? So, and granted, you might know that if you read enough of the documentation, but a lot of people, they're copying and pasting. They just want to get up and running, right? They don't want to spend the upfront time to have like deep, like tacit knowledge of Kubernetes just to get their containerized application deployed. So we move back into the deployment, and we see that, in fact, here in the deployment, our container ports are listed as 8080. So the other thing they noticed, and that you'll see here, is that the current image is still current. And remember, we had to fix it previously. We had to change it to latest. And so what that means is if we edited that pod and we happen to not have this port wrong, which gave us another hint to come look at the deployment, and we were to say, like, scale up the replicas here, right? When those replicas scaled up, those new pods would fail in the same way that the previous one failed. But the good news about that is that we would see that in the events, right? We would get that same error for those new pods in the events. So fortunately, fortunately or unfortunately, we had the mismatch of 8080 to 80 in the ports. So we saw that was a problem in the deployment. And so though Octant does allow you to do just an edit for your container image right here, which I can show you. We could swap it to latest here. We don't have the ability to change the container ports from here, but we can just go again straight into the YAML editor as before, and we can find that section of our deployment where we define those container ports, and we can update them to be 8080 or to be 80 instead of 8080. Now we've applied this change. We have a new pod running. You see it's 12 seconds old. And if again, we now try to test what we had tested before, which is our port forward, right? We get a success. So that's definitely progress in the right direction. So now we can say with a pretty high level of confidence that this deployment, which created this replica set, which has created this pod, this is a healthy path through here. So with that, we can probably try our main endpoint again, right? Our outside service. This is coming from some public domain and into the cluster, but we're still getting this no healthy upstream, which is I mean, if you're familiar with other serving tools and Nginx or HA proxy you've used in the past, but you're not really, you kind of know maybe what that means. Maybe you Google for it. So we head back into the namespace overview to kind of get an idea of what's happening, because that's where we found before we were having this set of problems, right? And while we're here, we'll notice some of these old replica sets still hanging out because of the image change. And Octant gives you a convenient way to kind of just remove some of these resources and things that you might not need. So we'll just go ahead and remove those old replica sets while we're here. So as we scroll through this, you can see we have our ingress. It looks fine. And then we get to our service. Now our service is showing some type of status warning here, and that's the service has no endpoint addresses. So let's just click on that and see what's going on here. So it doesn't seem like there are any endpoints. That seems true. And if we take a look at the resource viewer, right, we can see that the ingress looks okay, right? We can verify that and come in, and it's linking to this JSON server service. And so what would cause it to not have any endpoints? So that's probably something where we end up having to go out and Google, and that's exactly what we did. We Googled it, and we found that we learned that services, right, their endpoints can be done via selectors, right? And if you have the right selector, you get an endpoint created automatically for you. And in our case, we're looking at our selector and we're noticing a typo. And that is something that we can correct, again, by going to the YAML edit, right? But what if I don't actually know, right? So the other option is I can go back to is it the deployment selector? Is it what's the selector I'm supposed to use here? And Octant kind of gives you a convenient way to navigate through and try them, right? So this shows you your list of potential selectors to choose from. We have the one that's currently there. We have another one that is an annotation for a Kubernetes application. And then we have this other one that is just a straight app::JSON server. So we're going to try this one and submit it and see if that makes a difference. And when we did that, we immediately got this endpoint mapping that shows up. And that's also now reflected here in the resource viewer. You can see before, when we were looking at this, all we saw was this deployment replica set pod. We didn't see this ingress service pod, right? So we didn't have that idea that those things were connected. And now, by fixing this selector and having it select the correct thing, or what we presume is the correct thing, we can now clearly see this chain of, here's our deployment that we created and got things, and then here's this ingress and service that we created and how they are now connected to this pod. So that's fixed now. We should be able to visit our workload. Wait, there's yet another error. And so here we can, the benefit that we're seeing here is that as we're working through these errors, the error messages are shifting and changing. But what we don't need to do, because we've already done this, is we know that the deployment replica set pod path, right? We know that this works, right? We verified that our pod through this port forward is doing what we expect. It's running the workload correctly. It's running this container right. So we can remove that whole line of like troubleshooting and thinking from our brains while we try to figure out what this means. And going back to the resource viewer, we're going to know that it exists somewhere in this path, right? Like this path of ingress service pod is where this problem is taking place. So I'm just going to start at the top and work my way through from the ingress. So the ingress itself is a simple one. I have it set up to just match anything, and I'm mounting my. I mean, I don't think this would be very common, but I'm just mounting it on the root domain, right? And in this case, for the demo, it's localhost. So if I click through to here, this piece seems like the piece that there's something wrong with it. And so this is one of those where it might be hard to find, because it's if you're staring at something for a long period of time, it's kind of easy to move 8s and 0s around and not notice them. But one of the things here is, if we started to just check off items like, okay, we have the right selector, it's cluster IP, the ports. Oh, I remember we had to fix the ports before. And if we go take a look at what we were like back at the deployment, we remember that when we were looking at this deployment, originally this was set to 8080, which makes sense that the service that's controlling that deployment, or that's controlling the ingress into what that deployment is creating, was also set to 8080. So this is something we don't have an edit for it here in the options. We need to go into the YAML editor and fix this target port, right? And when we update this target port, what we'll see is that we don't really get, like, nothing tells us that that was the right thing to do. It's just, this is one of those contextual items that we're hoping, you know, we can, this is an example of something where we're hoping long-term Octant can kind of start to surface and drive actionable items around some of these things, you know, where it could have some intelligence around the fact that your deployment is on 80 and all of your pods are on 80, and you have a service on 8080, maybe it should be 80, right? If there was a little thing that popped up here and just said, hey, this doesn't look right. And that's what we mean when we say we want it to be like a high fidelity view. We really want to get the contextual actionable information up to developers so that they can do something with it. So with that fix on my service, I can now go back out and try this again. And look at that. So we have a successful ingress into our service, like into our pod, and everything seems to be functioning and working exactly as we would expect it. And now our resource viewer is all green. Our namespace overview, as we scroll through the list, we have green statuses for everything, and we no longer have any issues, and things appear to work as they should. One of the things that I wanted to mention quickly that we are also working on is the applications view, which when you have metrics enabled, I forgot that Kind doesn't support metrics, so my mistake. When you have metrics enabled, you will see the information around CPU and memory alongside this here. And when you click this, you get kind of a view of your workload and the resource viewer to help you start to navigate it and learn it. Our goal is to kind of turn this into an entry point for developers and people who want to understand specific workloads into how those things are functioning within the cluster and get them there quickly. And so one thing I'll show is that, when we scale up the replicas, when you go back to here, you'll see that there's now 4 pods, and we can see the pods listed here as well. So, so really that's it. And so now at this point, we would try and copy and paste some of this out and go make our YAML edits and make our updates to ensure that we are preserving all of those changes and those fixes that we made. And we also would, then commit that to our source control or whatever we have. So, and that's it for the walkthrough of getting a workload up and running and debugging it with Octant. We are now in the Q&A section, so I will put that slide up in 1 second. And we'll open it up to active questions.
Perfect. Thank you so much. Thanks for the great presentation. As Wayne said, we now have time for some more questions. Feel free to put them into the Q&A box at the bottom of the screen if you still have some. I think we have quite a bit of time, and there is not enough question for as much time as we have so far. So let me just start at the bottom from Mike Fowley, which is kind of a long one. Let me try to sum that up. It's not really a question, but he tried installing Octant on Windows 2019 and got an error that Octant is not installed due to the package not being found. So he tried to download it as octant.exe and got a different set of errors. In the end, leading to custom resource definition unauthorized. Anything you can say to that running Octant on Windows? I mean, you're using Linux, if I've seen that correctly.
Yeah, so Mike, I would say that the error that you're getting is not normal, and that the chocolatey install has been known to work well. So if you're getting an unauthorized issue when running the Octant executable, it is likely due to the configuration with the kubeconfig. And if you wanted to come and get some help, interactive help, getting up and running and debugging what's going on, we have the Kubernetes Slack channel. And that is, let me have the right slide up so people can get, we have the Kubernetes Octant Slack channel. I would recommend joining that, and we can help you get your issue resolved with getting Octant up and going on Windows.
Perfect. There is Florian who's asking, the resource looks like a great help to understand the relationships between resources. Apart from this, how would you compare Octant with Lens, previously Contina Lens?
Hey, Wayne, let me take this one.
Okay.
So, hello, I'm Brian Lyles. I'm actually the creator of Octant, and it's just nice to see someone actually demoing your software. It's like having your kid grow up. But when it comes to Lens and Infra, and what's the other one? K8s. Really, we're just a group of people who are trying to give you a view into your cluster. And how does Octant differ from all those? Well, no one has a resource viewer, and that was like V1 resource viewer. We're working on a new version. Octant's goal is to show you what's going on in your cluster, not just to be a list of stuff. Unfortunately, we have to have a list of stuff to make it useful. But really, like Wayne was showing, we know like when your ingress service, your workload is wrong. We want to be able to put the infrastructure in place to not only just show it, but actually say, your thing is broken because of this reason. And a lot of tools are just meant to be dashboards or show you the current state of the world or show you graphs or whatnot. Octant's taking a different approach. It's trying to make you a better user of Kubernetes. And will we do some of the other stuff? Yeah, definitely. But that's the main difference. Is our actual goal is to make you mesh with Kubernetes better.
Cool. Thank you so much for answering that. Conrad is asking, are there plans to create Octant port for Mac ports? Also, is it possible to add Octant as a plugin to kubectl?
So right now there is no kubectl plugin. We're actually in the process of making Octant be a native application for all the platforms. This doesn't mean that it won't ever be a kubectl plugin, but the current vision for Octant is to kind of make it something that you can run and easily get started with by pointing it to a kubeconfig or uploading a kubeconfig, and then also having native or integrated notifications so that you can see when things are going wrong, or when you're editing YAMLs and applying them, you can get notified of status errors and warnings and things like that. As for the Mac ports, Sam might have a better answer for that. I think I know the answer, but Sam handles most of our packaging stuff, so I'll defer to him.
Cool. So next one by Warren is, with all the manual changes to the YAML in Octant, the original source of the kubectl apply apparently eventually gets out of date. So is there a way for Octant to tell the user you need to update your original file? Or is there even some kind of GitOps workflow that you could integrate this with?
Yeah, that's great. That's why I called that out at the end too, that I would need to go and manually pull this out and store it. So right now we do not notify you that there's an update, but we want to. And we don't know what that's going to look like yet, but that is something that I'm very interested in having as being part of Octant, is to kind of track some of the edits that you might be making and then get them out in a way that is actually useful to preserve them, or get them connected directly into some repo. Because as you saw, there's a lot of like metadata information that gets injected into the YAML by the Kubernetes API. And if you copy and paste out that whole thing and try to rerun it and apply it, it gets really messy, and it has a lot of things in there that are just unnecessary. So yes, we would like some way for Octant to do that, but currently it does not.
Cool. Maybe even leading up to that, great tool for introspect into workloads inner working, but when used in production, and I can really feel that having the edit button may be counterproductive or dangerous. So it's probably more intended for development, or what's the goal?
So we're definitely targeting the people who are developing against Kubernetes and want to run their applications there. I wouldn't say that it is not useful in production. Likely, if you have, so this is an opinion, this is not anything else. If you have if your kubeconfig has the ability for you to make edits, which means you can do it with kubectl, and you're running Octant, then there's no difference between having that edit button and having the ability to apply a new YAML with kubectl. Now, if you do not want somebody to be able to do that, then you give them a kubeconfig that is read-only, so they can't apply the edits, right? So, so no, I don't think it's dangerous. I don't think it's counterproductive, because it's really surfacing what you can already do anyway. There's no, and you don't get any enhanced permissions or anything that you couldn't normally do with command line tools just because you're running Octant.
Yeah, and I can really share that opinion from professional experience as well. Really rather make your kube config secure and not give people too much permissions, and not blame the tool on top of it.
Yeah. But I will say one more thing about that.
Huh?
I mean, we say that, and we say that like that's easy. One of the unspoken goals of Octant is to make hard things easy, and really we're telling people, oh, just make this read-only config. And people are like, whoa, hold on. There's not even a great RBAC editor, a visual RBAC editor out there right now. I've been sitting on a design for months, just trying to get that right because it's so nuanced. But we want to really put people into better places. So having a read-only mode, yeah, that's a good idea. I think it could be as a flag or an option. But we also want to fix the problem from the other side too, and put people in a good place where they can actually do that from the other side, and then we can, we know what you can see, and then we'll just turn that option off.
Yep, perfect. Thank you so much. Is it possible to install Octant in Kubernetes itself and share it across the team?
So let me take this one, Wayne. So yeah, 100% it is possible. But let me tell you why that's not a great idea. So one of the things you'll notice with Octant is that it's real time. And the way that we do this is we actually cache your current namespace locally in memory. You can install it in cluster. We don't provide the directions anymore because it was just confusing people, but there is an incantation that you can actually run. Octant is an Angular app and a Go app. You can actually run that inside of a container, inside of a cluster, and then use a service and an ingress to expose it. But that's not the answer. What we really want to do is think about how people want to run this in the server, because if we run it in the server with one set of access and then you have read and write, guess what? You get into the Kubernetes dashboard issue real quick. And we've just elided that whole thing by keeping it local. Now, when we actually start talking about Octant running in a cluster, it's going to look the same, but on the back end, it's probably going to be a different app, because we can't do the whole Informer thing for everyone running in the cluster. Octant does take a memory hit if you're on a decent sized cluster with a couple handfuls of namespaces with more than a few handfuls of objects. Octant will take 60, 70, 80, 90, 150 megabytes of memory depending on what you have. There's no way that anyone could run this in cluster with a lot of people running it that way. So the idea is that we're going to have to do some magic with a great read-only view, and then some trickery around the read-write stuff. Problem is that Kubernetes API does not make this easy. It was made for different types of one-off tools and controllers, but not for real-time interactive tools. So we're learning, and plans are being made on how to do this. But it is a good idea. We just need to figure out what it looks like.
Cool. Are there any plans to be able to create one's Kubernetes architecture directly in Octant, like the defunct project YPIO from Conrad Taylor?
Not today. So I don't actually even work on Octant part-time now. One of the other things in my secret projects that I'm working on right now is actually rethinking that. But there is a project out there right now, Ice Panel, and they have a Kubernetes editor. No one actually sat down and figured out how do you actually do that in real time for a cluster. It's easy to make a one-off configuration, but what do you do whenever you have deployments that generated replica sets that generated pods? It becomes, and then also, I cheated inside of Octant, and I made it so that services directly connect to pods, but there's actually an endpoint there. I would love that, but then I would ask people, well, why do you want that? And actually what you're probably asking for is a better tool for that. And something we're thinking about. If anyone has any ideas, all open source. So please contribute. But I think we want to solve that problem in a slightly different way and then have Octant work with that tool.
Great. I cannot pronounce that name. Wants to know, does Octant support vSphere 7.0 Kubernetes clusters? Yeah,
it supports, right now, I would wager that Octant supports any Kubernetes greater than 1.12. 1.14 is a definite. I'm running it with 1.18. I have Octant pointed to a cluster that is on vSphere 7 right now. So yeah, it should really work with anything that's Kubernetes. And if it doesn't, please report it as a bug, because it is.
That's a good way of putting it. For large-scale production workloads deployed in different clusters, how can we aggregate the monitoring data from Octant?
Oh, well, actually, there's an easy answer for this. You don't. So here's a very important thing. VMware also has another product called TMC, Tanzu Mission Control, which is actually in that realm. We are very targeted in our open source efforts to ensure that it is one cluster, one namespace at a time.
Good. If you have any other questions, feel free to put them in, because if we are with the last one, Octant has great discovery capabilities. Do we have to subscribe to all of Octant, so to say the full platform? Can we leverage parts that make sense, kind of embed Octant's features inside some other application, but still retain some of the extensibility of the plugins?
Octant is Apache v2. As long as you adhere by the Apache v2 license, you can do whatever you want. Now, we're not going to support it, of course not, but any reasonable request, so anything that we have and that is not internal, but anything that's in github.com/vmware-tanzu/octant/package, I will say we will support that. But anything else, no, we don't have a stable API for that. But I'll definitely talk to you about it if you were to ping me somewhere.
Cool. There is lots of people saying thank you for the efforts, especially for the newbies in Kubernetes world. So I think that's not a question, but that's definitely to mention. Last but not least, from Conrad Taylor, are there any plans for better integration with Git, or more specifically GitHub within Octant?
So I'm assuming this means around like a GitOps type thing. I don't know. Wait and see.
Yeah, I could see that. I could see it going either way. I could also see that just as a plugin that someone else does. It really just depends.
Last chance, guys. Any questions? Thanks for the demo. It's not a question, but I will send that onwards as well. Thank you so much for coming. So also thank you, Wayne, for the great presentation. And that's all we have for today. Thank you so much for joining, and have a great day, everyone. The webinar recording and the slides will be online later today, and we are looking forward to see you at the next webinar by CNCF. Take care.